In the spring of 1841, Colleton County simmered under a heat so heavy it pressed against the skin like liquid iron. Spanish moss dripped from the gnarled live oaks along the sluggish Combie River, hanging like funeral shrouds over waters dark as ink. Rice fields stretched in endless, waterlogged ribbons, their mirrored surfaces disturbed only by the figures of enslaved men and women, wading through knee-deep mud, bending under the weight of unseen suffering. Prosperity here was carved from misery, and yet, within the rigid world of white society, such cruelty was worshipped as the natural order. It was in this sweltering, unforgiving landscape that Silas Rutland made a proclamation that would shatter the brittle calm of his county's elite. The plantation owner of Cypress Grove, a man whose ambition clawed at the ceilings of power he could never reach, declared that his daughter, Catherine, a woman of 28, heavy-bodied and swollen with years of ill-prescribed remedies, would be placed entirely under the authority of a man he enslaved, Ezekiel Cross. Not as a nurse, not as a caretaker, but as her master in every sense that mattered. Only on paper she remained his daughter. In truth, she belonged to another. The announcement traveled through Colleton County like wildfire, leaving gossip scorched into the minds of the white families who considered themselves society's arbiters. Shock curdled their polite smiles, scandal whispered in every drawing room. None could imagine the darkness lurking behind Rutland's decision, nor the profound, terrible changes that would unfold in the months to come. By autumn, Catherine's body would bear transformations that defied reason. 13 men would die. Cypress Grove would be consumed by flame, reduced to ash. And all who survived would speak in terrified murmurs of the things Ezekiel Cross had done to her and what she had become. Silas Rutland himself was a man shaped by obsession. Thin, prematurely gray, his features sharp with the austerity of a life spent chasing status, he moved through the world like a shadow, cold and calculating. In business, he was ruthless yet precise, the kind of man who would take every advantage but never break his word. When his wife, Elizabeth Yancey, died giving birth to Catherine, he assumed both the role of father and warden, raising a daughter whose early years were marked by isolation, tutors, and a life kept separate from the frivolities and dangers of society. Catherine, meanwhile, grew trapped in a body that betrayed her. By the age of 28, she weighed over 260 pounds, swollen from decades of medications prescribed for female hysteria and nervous disorders. She would erupt in fits of violence, hurling objects in moments of uncontrollable rage. The previous year, she had driven a letter opener into her father's hand, leaving a scar across his flesh. To outsiders, she was a tragic, mad woman. To those who understood the shadows she had walked in as a child, her behavior was no madness at all. She had seen things, experienced horrors that had left her mind stretched taut, her survival instincts sharpened into something too strange, too potent to be labeled. Then, on April 7th, a letter arrived, delivered not by postman, but by a private courier. Silas, expecting routine correspondence, found instead a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax, stamped with a symbol he knew instantly, a scythe crossed with a stalk of wheat, the mark of the brethren of the harvest. This secretive circle of 13 men, was whispered about in fear and rumor. Practitioners of rituals that blended European occult tradition with the spiritual knowledge of the enslaved. They believed in power harvested from blood, strength taken from the weak, and the unthinkable notion that certain sacrifices were necessary to sustain the land itself. The letter contained a debt, a monstrous sum that would require the liquidation of all that Silas had built. $12,000, an impossible weight. Yet it also offered a way forward, a perverse alternative that demanded loyalty and courage beyond common measure. To satisfy the brethren, to preserve his holdings, Silas was to surrender his daughter. Catherine was to be placed entirely under the control of Ezekiel Cross, the enslaved man who had lived and worked on Cypress Grove since childhood. This would not be temporary. It would not be symbolic. For a full year, she would obey his commands, submit to his authority, experience life entirely through his eyes. Every detail of her existence, diet, movement, even thought, would answer to him. When the day came for the announcement, the white families of Colleton County gathered in polite anticipation. Silas explained it away as an extreme medical intervention, a desperate attempt to save his daughter from herself. Their laughter, their murmurs of pity, were hollow, failing to mask the unease curling at the edges of their minds. They had no idea of the forces at play, nor of the dark intelligence that smoldered in Ezekiel Cross, waiting for his moment. And then the transformation began. Catherine changed. Slowly at first, imperceptibly. The color of her skin, the shape of her body, the cadence of her voice, subtle alterations that drew the eyes of servants and overseers alike. People whispered of eyes that seemed to burn with something feral, of a presence that made the air thicken, as if the very plantation itself recognized the shift. The months that followed were punctuated by terror. Servants disappeared, their screams echoing in the night. Animals were found mutilated, shadows moved in impossible ways. By November, 13 men lay dead, each death more grotesque than the last. Cypress Grove, once the emblem of Silas Rutled's desperate ambitions, was reduced to smoldering ruins. No one could explain what Ezekiel Cross had done. No one could fully comprehend the bond between him and Catherine, forged in a crucible of secrecy, obedience, and dark, unnameable power. Those who glimpsed her afterward, if they lived, spoke only in trembling fragments, the way she moved, the way her voice carried through the trees, how her eyes seemed to pierce straight through the veil of the living. It was more than horror. It was transformation. It was the awakening of a force that had been dormant, waiting for the precise alignment of cruelty, desperation, and forbidden knowledge to ignite. So what truly happened at Cypress Grove? What did Ezekiel Cross do to Catherine, Rutland, that left bodies in his wake and burned a plantation to the ground? Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, too terrible to be believed. Yet the whispers endure, carried on the humid winds of Colleton County, twisting through moss-laden trees, past abandoned rice paddies, into the hearts of those willing to imagine the darkness that lies just beyond the reach of reason. Every shadow, every scream, every flicker of movement in the night at Cypress Grove was a testament to the power of fear and obsession. a reminder that cruelty can create monsters in places where no one dares to look. The story of Catherine, Ruttled, and Ezekiel Cross is not just one of death and destruction, but of transformation, of the subtle, horrifying ways in which the world bends when human ambition collides with forces it cannot contain. And even now, long after the ash has cooled, the echoes of what transpired still stir in the dark corners of the land, whispering secrets that only the brave or the foolish dare to follow. In a world that pretended to shield women, to value them above all, Silas Ruttled made a choice that tore at the very fabric of morality. He chose property over flesh, power over conscience, and in doing so, he tethered his daughter's life to the whims of another. The brethren of the harvest, shadowed figures who whispered in the night and moved through society like ghosts, offered him a perverse lifeline: surrender Catherine, and his debt would vanish, his fortune restored, his place among the powerful secured. To refuse was to invite ruin, not just financial but existential. They could erase him with a single whisper, manipulate judges, twist politicians, crush any opposition. The choice was clear to the man society had trained to value power above humanity. That night, Silas sat alone in the flickering candlelight of his study, staring at the dark corners of the room, as though the shadows themselves might offer counsel. Bankruptcy would obliterate him entirely. Yet to sacrifice his daughter's dignity, his only child, felt monstrous. And yet, under the brethren's unseen gaze, monstrosity was exactly what was required. By dawn, he had written his acceptance, the ink sealing a contract more horrifying than any paper should bear. 3 days later, another letter arrived, heavier, more deliberate. It contained the name that would become a fulcrum of fate: Ezekiel Cross, 33, purchased from Virginia through intermediaries. The letter detailed his skills, carpentry, herbal remedies, and described his temperament as quiet, obedient. But it said nothing of the fire that burned behind Ezekiel's calm exterior, nothing of the patient, deliberate calculation that had brought him to this very plantation, to this very family. This was no coincidence. Ezekiel had been chosen for a purpose that went far beyond obedience. He carried with him the weight of loss, the desire for vengeance, and the unshakable patience to wait for the perfect moment. On April 13th, a wagon rattled along the dirt road leading to Cypress Grove. Ezekiel sat upright in the back, framed by morning light, a figure of quiet power. Silas stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes, and froze as he met the man's gaze. Most enslaved men looked away, eyes lowered, a ritual of survival and subjugation. Ezekiel did not. He stared directly at Silas, calm, assessing, unflinching. The encounter left Silas unsettled in a way he could not name. Ezekiel was tall, broader than most, shoulders carved from years of relentless labor, yet his movements suggested skill, not mere brute force. His hands were calloused, but delicate where precision mattered. The slave trader, Henderson, descended from the wagon and handed Silas the official papers. Ezekiel Cross, carefully selected, the letter said. Quiet, capable, trained. Silas barely glanced at the documents. "You understand why you are here?" he asked, his voice brittle with the weight of the night's decision. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel answered, his voice low, steady, laced with a hint of a Virginia drawl. My daughter, she is unwell. You are responsible for her care. Doctors have failed. I know herbal remedies. Sir, Ezekiel replied, my grandmother taught me before I was sold. The arrangement was formalized quickly. Ezekiel was shown to a small cabin near the main house, set apart from the other quarters, given basic supplies, and informed that failure would carry severe consequences. He nodded when required, and then, for the first time, allowed the mask to slip. His shoulders relaxed, jaw unclenched, as he reached into the folds of his shirt and withdrew a small, worn cloth bundle. Inside was a scrap of paper, fragile and faded, inscribed with names in a trembling, childish hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. His family, torn from him 3 years earlier, sold to a plantation in Alabama where the work crushed them, and the world ignored their suffering. All 3 had perished within 18 months. Sarah from fever left untreated, Benjamin from a wound that festered unchecked, and Ruth, a child who simply gave up on life when no one explained why she had been wrenched from love and home. And the one who sold them, the one who treated their lives like firewood to prove loyalty to the brethren, was none other than Silas Ruttled. For 2 years, Ezekiel had journeyed southward, enduring the indignities of sale, observing, learning, waiting. Whispers told him of the brethren, of the rituals that bound them, of their belief in their own invulnerability. And when the chance to be placed in Cypress Grove arrived, he seized it. The house, the man, the secrets, he would have access to all. Justice, he understood, often demanded patience, planning, and the willingness to become as monstrous as the world required. He folded the paper carefully, eyes tracing the letters of those he had lost, and let the knowledge settle like ice in his chest. He lay back on the simple cot, staring at the rough, hewn ceiling, plotting the days to come, the movements that would shape his revenge, and the transformation of the household. April 14th arrived with its usual oppressive heat. A house slave, Judith, gray-haired and cautious, led him to Catherine's room on the 2nd floor. She hesitated at the door, knocking lightly. Miss Catherine, your father has brought someone to assist with your treatments, she whispered. A crash answered her, the sound of something heavy against wood. Catherine's voice, slurred, bitter, venomous, filled the room. I do not want more treatments! Send him away! Judith's eyes flicked to Ezekiel with sympathy. She has bad days, she murmured. This is one of them. Ezekiel did not respond. He opened the door, closing it behind him, sealing them in darkness. The room was large, heavy with shadows, curtains drawn, as if even the sunlight feared to enter. And there, in that dim, oppressive space, the slow, inexorable collision of 2 fates began, Catherine's body and mind, long misunderstood, and Ezekiel's calculated purpose, burning with the quiet ferocity of one who has lost everything. The plantation's air seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the walls themselves sensed the terrible events that would unfold, the secrets that would reshape every life beneath its roof. The air inside the room felt dead, as though it had been trapped for years, thick with the soreness of sweat and the faint metallic sweetness of mafui, clinging like an invisible film to the walls. Books were strewn across the floor like fallen birds, their pages bent and broken. A shattered frame lay against the far wall, its fractured glass catching what little light sneaked through the curtains. Clothes draped from furniture in chaotic heaps, as if thrown there in a fevered panic. Catherine sat curled in a chair beside a cold, soot-stained fireplace, wrapped tightly in a dressing gown mottled with stains she could no longer account for. Her hair fell in tangled sheets around her face, a dark curtain for eyes swollen and clouded with confusion. Her fingers trembled without rest, clenching the chair's wooden arms as if they were the only things tethering her to reality. She stared at Ezekiel first with bewilderment, then dread, then a flicker of rage that burned like a dying ember suddenly stirred. "Who are you?" "I said no more doctors." "I am not a doctor, miss," Ezekiel replied, his voice steady and low. "My name is Ezekiel. Your father sent me to help." "Help." The word came out of her mouth like poison. She laughed, sharp, fractured, far too loud for the hushed room. "That is what they all claim. Help, treatment, medicine. They mean confinement. They mean silence. They mean chains." She lurched to her feet, swaying dangerously as if her bones were no longer sure they could bear her weight. "I know what this is. He wants to punish me again, for remembering, for speaking, for refusing to forget." Ezekiel didn't move. His stillness filled the room like a second darkness. "What are you supposed to forget?" he asked quietly. The question stunned her. For a moment her face softened, trembling not from weakness but from a truth too heavy to hold. "You don't know," she whispered. "I know nothing, miss," he answered, carefully. "Only that your father insists you are unwell." She studied him, her gaze narrowing, as though she were seeing something hidden beneath his skin, something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't define. "You're not from here." "Virginia, originally." Her voice dropped to almost a breath. "Do you know what happens in this house? What they do beneath it in the cellar?" His pulse quickened, but he gave no sign. "I don't know what you mean, Leah." The word held no anger, just a tired certainty. "Everyone lies. It hurts less than truth." She collapsed back into the chair, exhausted. "Leave me." Tell him his newest torment failed. But Ezekiel walked past her to the window. With a single motion he yanked the curtains open. Light howled into the room. Catherine shrieked, covering her face like someone recoiling from fire. "When did you last see the sun?" Ezekiel asked. "I can't go outside. I'm too weak." "When did you last eat without swallowing that medicine?" "I an idiot," she snapped. "The doctors said." "What if the doctors are wrong?" The words hung in the air like a blade. Her hands slowly lowered, her eyes large and startled. "What did you say?" Ezekiel turned from the window, his voice a quiet storm. "I said, what if everything you've been forced to swallow was never meant to heal you? What if it was meant to control you? What if someone has been poisoning you to ensure you never become strong enough to speak about the things you witnessed?" Silence swallowed the room whole. Catherine froze, trembling no longer from illness, but from awakening. He told you. Your father told me note hing, Ezekiel said softly. But I know what mercury does to a body. I know the signs. Healthy women don't crumble unless someone is working very hard to make them crumble. Her suspicion flickered back, reluctant but desperate. Why would you say this? Why would you care? Because, Ezekiel answered, I can help you regain your strength. I can help you see clearly again, but stopping the poison will hurt. Your body depends on it now, and your father will fight to keep things exactly as they are. Then why help me? His answer burned with a quiet, terrifying honesty. Because I have my own reasons for wanting Silas Ruttled to suffer, and the worst punishment I can give him is to return his daughter strong, clear-minded, and able to name every horror she has been forced to swallow. He had spoken the truth plainly, dangerously. Catherine's eyes sharpened. She saw the flames beneath his calm exterior. What did he do to you? He sold my family. Ezekiel murmured, my wife, my 2 children. Sent them to die so he could prove his loyalty to monsters who worship cruelty. Catherine absorbed this with chilling composure, then nodded as if pieces long scattered suddenly slid into place. The brethren, she whispered. He sold them for the brethren. You know of them. She laughed, a broken, manic sound. You'll learn. Everyone does in this house. Her expression shifted, gaining clarity sharp enough to cut. If I agree, if I let you help me, what happens then? You get well, Ezekiel said. And when you are well, we decide what comes next. You have your revenge. I have mine. Our paths may lead to the same place. Catherine stared into him, searching for cracks. Finding none. I want them DA'd, she breathed. My father, Judge Pillum, Reverend Crenshaw, every man who stood in that cellar. I want them to KNW fear before they die. I want their begging to echo through the walls. Her fury was terrible, not for its volume, but for its clarity. This was not madness. This was truth sharpened by agony. Then we understand one another, Ezekiel said quietly. She leaned forward, her eyes glowing with a darkness that seemed almost luminous. Then understand this, Ezekiel, she whispered. I have killed before. 3 of the house slaves. They saw moments when my mind broke free. They would have told him. I don't remember how I did it. The laudanum makes everything blur, but I know they never left this land alive. She smiled, slow and dreadful. And I am not finished. If you plan to betray me, to manipulate me, to discard me as if I were nothing, know this, I am not a victim. I am something far worse. The words landed like ice along Ezekiel's spine. He had anticipated an ally, someone broken, someone malleable. Instead, he found a storm, coiled and patient, capable of violence that rivaled his own, and yet he did not flinch. He could not. I believe you, miss, he said quietly, and I will not betray you. Could. Her voice, though thin from weakness, carried a dangerous certainty. She stood taller, swaying only slightly. Then let us begin. But I have one condition. When this is over, when we have had our revenge, I want to die. I do not wish to linger in a world that has shown me what it is capable of. You will help me with that, too. Ezekiel did not speak immediately. He had not expected this. Death offered freely as part of a bargain was not something he had prepared for. And yet, the commitment had already begun, binding them together in purpose. Agreed, he finally said. Then we have a deal. She extended her hand, firm and unwavering. After a moment's hesitation, Ezekiel took it. Her grip surprised him, strength coiled into a body he had assumed weak. a promise of endurance hidden beneath layers of suffering. The first week passed in measured, grueling steps. Ezekiel began the slow unbinding of Catherine from years of laudanum dependency. He replaced some doses with carefully prepared herbal tinctures, valerian root to soothe anxiety and summon rest, chamomile to quiet the restless stomach, milk thistle to cleanse the liver burdened by accumulated poison. The process was savage in its honesty. 3 days she writhed in fever, trembling, vomiting into basins while he knelt beside her, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring the quiet assurance that she was not alone, that someone had chosen to be with her in the storm. When the worst passed, she was fragile, yet her mind sharpened like a blade freshly whetted. Tremors eased, speech cleared, focus returned. Her eyes, once clouded and distant, now searched, analyzed, and measured the world again. Physical recovery came next. Ezekiel had her walking short distances, room to hallway and back, each day a little further. He adjusted her diet, lean meats, fresh vegetables, no pastries or sugary comforts. Resistance met with patience, guidance, and a firm hand. She struggled, not out of rebellion, but because food had been her only solace, her tether to a world that had otherwise demanded nothing but compliance. Slowly, inch by painful inch, she reclaimed her strength. And then the stories came. Catherine spoke of the cellar, of the unspeakable acts she had witnessed at 12, of the cruelty that had etched itself into the bones of the household. Her voice, steady now, recounted the years of gaslighting, her father convincing all, even her, that she was insane, that her memories were inventions, that her truth was a lie. She shared details from a journal hidden for decades, dates, late night visitors, sounds from below that should have been impossible. Ezekiel, in turn, shared fragments of his own shattered life. He told her of Sarah, who sang while laboring and taught their children to read despite looming danger. Of Benjamin, gifted and curious, whose small hands deciphered arithmetic beyond his age, whose laughter could have been a lifeline. Of Ruth, wild and delicate, who gathered flowers to make their cabin bloom amidst the cruelty. And how Silas Rutald, with deliberate calculation, had torn them apart, smiling as he did, treating lives as if they were kindling for some infernal fire. That is what I remember most, Ezekiel said quietly, voice breaking in the barest way. My son clutching my leg, crying, my wife trying to be brave, and your father smiling, as if the pain pleased him. Catherine's gaze, now clear, met his. I am sorry, she whispered, but words fell short. Sorry is just a word, but I am sorry you endured what you did. You are not responsible for his actions. Ezekiel said gently. No, she countered, but I am responsible for what comes next. And I promise you, Ezekiel, they will all pay. Every last one of them. Weeks passed, the careful reconstruction of body and mind reaching its first public trial. On April 29th, the formal announcement was set. 40 uninvited guests assembled in the Cypress Grove dining room, the county's elite arriving in carriages, dressed in finery and ignorance. Judge Pelham with his wife, Reverend Crenshaw with his daughter, Marcus Fanning, Benjamin Lyall from the bank, each unaware that the room held a quiet storm of observation and preparation. The table groaned under the weight of indulgent oysters, roasted duck, trays of rice and sweet potatoes, freshly baked bread, and at the center, a cake towering like a monument to excess. Catherine sat at her father's right, restrained in her consumption, measured in speech, her face a mask of calm. Ezekiel moved among the servants silently, invisible yet absorbing every detail, cataloging every word, every gesture, every subtle glance that betrayed intentions and weaknesses. When dessert ended, Silas rose, tapping his glass with authority. "My friends," he began, voice smooth and measured. "As you know, Catherine has suffered for years. We have sought every remedy. Doctors from Charleston, a specialist from Philadelphia. Nothing succeeded until recently." He gestured toward Ezekiel. 2 weeks, he said, had wrought a remarkable transformation. Catherine, the room was told, had improved, regained composure and clarity. A murmur ran through the gathering, polite, hesitant, unconvinced. Catherine's expression remained neutral, though Ezekiel glimpsed her hands gripping her napkin beneath the table, knuckles white with suppressed tension. Silas continued, voice cerruched with propriety and deceit. The improvement had led him to a difficult decision. Catherine required care beyond the household's capacity. Therefore, he declared, Ezekiel would assume complete authority over her life, her movements, her treatment, and her very being, effective immediately. The room absorbed the announcement with polite applause, unaware that beneath the surface, a conspiracy had been sealed. Catherine's eyes flicked to Ezekiel. No words were exchanged, but the pact was clear. They were now co-conspirators, bound by purpose, by survival, and by the darkness that had already begun to reshape the very walls of Cypress Grove. Outside, the wind shifted through the moss-laden trees as though carrying a whisper. The storm had only just begun. The murmurs around the dining table had shifted, the polite hum of surprise rippling into confusion. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. Mrs. Pelham's mouth opened slightly, frozen mid-expression, shock carved into her features. Marcus Fanning leaned forward, voice tight with disbelief. "Silas, I do not understand. You are placing your daughter under the care of a slave permanently." Silas's eyes glinted with cold precision. "I am placing her with someone who has succeeded where others have failed. My daughter's health, her clarity, is more important than social convention." A cautious voice interrupted, Reverend Crenshaw's measured tone barely rising above the hush. "Surely there are alternatives. A companion, a nurse, someone of more appropriate station." Silas's jaw tightened, his decision already carved into stone. "I have made my choice." Catherine agrees. "Do you not, daughter?" All eyes turned to her. Here was the pivot point, the moment when she could resist, expose everything, bring the house crashing down around them. She smiled instead, a small, controlled curve of lips that revealed nothing yet held everything. "I trust my father's judgment," she said softly, measured, immaculate. "Ezekiel has been kind. His treatments help. I am content with this arrangement, perfectly delivered. To everyone else, a simple acquiescence." But Ezekiel saw beneath the surface, the white, knuckled grip on her napkin, the sharp flicker of her eyes promising fire, violence, and reckoning. She played the obedient daughter as the world demanded, but inside, she was screaming in the language of fury and preparation. The evening trudged forward in strained conversation. Some guests departed early, unwilling to linger in discomfort. Others lingered to whisper questions to Silas, carefully veiling curiosity and suspicion. Ezekiel listened, every fragment catalogued, words, gestures, even the briefest glance, storing everything in the hidden archives of his mind. "Are you certain this is wise?" He overheard Judge Pelham murmur near the study. "What will people say? The brethren will not approve of this being public." Silas replied softly, the words lost to the distance, but the subtle nod of Pelham's head and the clap on his shoulder told Ezekiel all he needed to know. Approval had been secured, or at least consented to, and the gears of their conspiracy moved silently beneath the veneer of propriety. By midnight, silence reclaimed the house. Guests had fled into the night, their carriages rolling over shadowed paths. Catherine ascended to her room, Silas retreated to his study, and Ezekiel moved quietly through the now empty corridors, performing the simple tasks that kept appearances intact. Then he knocked softly on Catherine's door. "Come in," came the voice, low and steady. She sat by the window, still dressed in the remnants of her formal attire, staring out over the darkened grounds. She did not turn. "It is done then. I am officially your responsibility," Ezekiel said carefully, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "Property of property," she murmured, almost amused. "How absurd." "How are you feeling, miss?" "I want to burn this house down, with everyone in it," she said quietly, but her eyes betrayed the calm calculation beneath the words. "Patience," he reminded her. "That is what you tell me." "Yes," I agreed, "so they will feel secure. They will think this is only my father's eccentricity, that I am as harmless as they assume. We let them forget while we prepare." She finally turned to him, eyes glittering like darkened steel. "Did you see their faces tonight? The disgust, the pity. They think me pathetic. They have no idea what is coming. And what is coming, miss?" Ezekiel asked, voice low, deliberate. Catherine moved to her dresser, pulling open a small wooden box. Inside, papers scrawled with her unmistakable hand were stacked like a collection of warnings, a testament to years of careful observation and survival. "I have documented everything I can remember," she said, voice tinged with feral pride. "Dates, names, rituals, encoded so that if anyone found them, they would see nonsense. But we can decode it. Enough to destroy 20 men. And will anyone believe us?" Ezekiel asked, his tone measured, wary. "No, a woman recently recovered from madness and an enslaved man. No, that is why we need proof. Physical proof they cannot dismiss. Evidence that cannot be ignored." She pulled out one sheet, worn but precise. "The ledger exists. The brethren maintain records of every ritual, every sacrifice, every member's participation. It binds them all. My father mentioned it years ago, before he realized I would remember everything." "Where?" Ezekiel asked, his pulse quickening. "In the cellar, beyond the main chamber, hidden. I have never seen it myself, only heard whispers. But it exists. That is where they keep what they cannot risk losing." Excitement and dread tangled inside Ezekiel. To reach the ledger would be to enter the heart of the brethren's domain, the core of their power. But the potential payoff was immense. Proof enough to unravel empires built on secrecy and terror. My father leaves for Charleston on May 14th. 3 days. That gives us exactly 2 weeks to prepare, she said, eyes glinting with meticulous calculation. We need every layout, every hidden passage, every guard schedule. Every detail matters. I can help, Ezekiel said. I have considered this for 16 years. I know what must be done. For the next hour, they spoke in whispers, drawing the cellar, tracing keys, memorizing routines. Shadows of the house stretched across the floor as if eavesdropping, the air thick with anticipation. When Ezekiel finally left, the clock read nearly 2 in the morning. He returned to his small room, candle flickering against the walls, and unfolded the paper bearing the names of his lost family. For you. For Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He whispered to the empty room, voice breaking with quiet fury. For everyone destroyed by men who believe power gives them the right to kill. He blew out the candle and lay in darkness, listening to the house settle. Somewhere beneath him, in a cellar he had never seen, lay the secrets that could shatter South Carolina's most powerful families. In 2 weeks, he would descend into that darkness. The fortnight passed in deceptive calm. Catherine grew sharper, lighter, stronger. Her weight dropped. Her steps lengthened. She translated sections of her coded journals, revealing the networked horror of the Brethren. Colleton County was no isolated nest of corruption. Its tendrils spread across the South. Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Richmond. Different names, same rituals, same obsession with control, same ruthless enforcement. And all of it could be undone if they were careful, patient, and willing to embrace the darkness they would wield. Catherine's voice carried the weight of secrets no one should ever have learned, let alone survived. She spoke of wealthy men who cloaked themselves in the illusion of ancient authority, men who believed their cruelty flowed from forgotten rights that stretched back beyond kingdoms and empires. They justified their violence by dressing it in the language of lineage, as if age alone could cleanse the rot. She told Ezekiel how European occult societies had blended their beliefs with fragments they scavenged from enslaved people, weaving foreign threads into a tapestry so grotesque it mocked every culture it stole from. What emerged was not tradition, not faith, but a perversion used to excuse unspeakable acts. The victims were not always people, she said, though that hardly softened the truth. Livestock taken in the night, dogs dragged into the woods, any creature they could sacrifice without question. But when the moon was high and their hunger sharpened, they chose human offerings, those who would not be missed, the invisible, the silenced, those trapped by circumstance or chains, wandering laborers swallowed by the dark, enslaved people without kin to ask why they vanished. Once, Catherine had overheard her father mention a child. She never learned if it was metaphor or confession. When Ezekiel asked what became of the bodies, she did not hesitate. Every plantation held its own graveyard disguised as wetlands. The swamps devoured everything. Once a body slid beneath the surface, the murk and the creatures that lived within it erased all evidence. Nothing returns, she whispered. Nothing ever comes back. And somewhere beneath their feet, a book existed, proof of every ritual performed across decades. Names inked beside dates, details preserved in chilling clarity. They had written it all down to bind themselves together in guilt, ensuring no one could betray the rest without condemning themselves. Mutual damnation masquerading as unity. Then the 14th of May arrived, a day they had circled in their minds with equal dread and anticipation. Silas departed before dawn, carriage wheels crunching over gravel, his loyal servant beside him. Business in Charleston awaited him, he claimed. Associates, deals, obligations. He would return by the evening of the 16th. 3 days, 3 nights, a narrow window carved into the fabric of danger. When darkness settled on the first night, they waited. Let the house breathe. Let the routine unfold. The servants retired. The hall stilled. By the time the clock chimed its slow descent into silence, the estate lay dormant, wrapped in the illusion of safety. Ezekiel slipped into Catherine's room. She stood by the window in plain, dark clothing, her hair bound tightly, her expression sharpened into something resolute. She did not look like a sheltered daughter of privilege. She looked like someone stepping willingly into war. "Are you certain?" he asked. Her reply came like steel drawn from a sheath. "I have never been more certain. Let's begin." The entrance to the cellar hid behind the kitchen pantry, disguised as ordinary paneling. But when Catherine pressed a particular spot, the wall clicked open, revealing a narrow staircase that swallowed light. And then came the smell. Damp soil, smoke from forgotten fires, something faintly sweet and unbearably decayed. The stench of history, but not the kind one preserves. "You grow accustomed to it," she murmured as they descended. "Or at least you pretend to." The lantern Ezekiel carried cast a muted glow, barely enough to tame the shadows. The steps groaned beneath their weight, old wood complaining like a living thing. When they reached the bottom, the enormity of the chamber struck him, larger than any cellar a household should need, stretching wide under low beams that dripped with moisture. Earthen floors worn by countless footsteps, stone walls slick with condensation, and at the center the table. Catherine called it the altar, though time had stripped it of its ceremonial veneer. Thick wood, deep grooves carved by blades, stains so stubborn they seemed to pulse in the lantern's light. Around it, candle stands, jars sealed with wax, boxes whose contents whispered threats through their silence, and a rack of garments, dark robes edged in blood-colored threads. Catherine moved without hesitation, navigating the space as if retracing nightmares she had never truly escaped. She stopped at the far wall, lifted her hand, and pressed a stone that looked no different from its neighbors. A soft click answered her. A hidden door slid inward, revealing a smaller chamber. Inside, the air felt heavier, as if the room held its breath in expectation. Shelves lined with jars that Ezekiel refused to study. Ledgers stacked neatly, and at the center, raised on a wooden stand, the book they had come for. Bound in darkened leather reinforced with tarnished metal, it resembled a tomb more than a journal. Catherine whispered, "There. That is the heart of it." Ezekiel opened it with the reverence one gives something equally sacred and cursed. Thick pages greeted him, filled with handwriting so precise it seemed almost proud. He read, and each line carved deeper into him. Rituals aligned with seasons, lives taken to strengthen the harvest, offerings tailored to their twisted beliefs. not random violence, but structured brutality. And worse, passages describing how victims were carved and consumed, the men believing that devouring flesh would grant them vitality, dominance, power. Ezekiel felt bile rise, but he forced himself to continue. Then he found the entry that shattered the last remnants of his restraint. A brief notation from years ago. His mother's name, his siblings, sold, separated, payment received. The destruction of his entire family condensed into a handful of indifferent words. A ledger entry treated with the same weight as an inventory list. "We take this," he said, voice trembling with rage. Catherine caught his arm. "If we remove it, they will know immediately. We need copies. Evidence we can hide. Evidence they can't erase. Patience over fury. Strategy over impulse." He nodded, though every fiber of him longed to destroy the room. They began their task. Hours passed in a steady, relentless rhythm. Catherine copied passages naming current members. Ezekiel recorded victims, each name a vow carved into his soul. Sometimes his hands shook too violently to continue. Sometimes she had to step outside, memories clawing at her throat. Still they pressed on, page after page, building the case that would one day bring an empire of shadows to ruin. And as the lantern dimmed, as the night pressed closer around them, a single truth settled between them like a living force. This was only the beginning. They were so locked inside their grim work that neither sensed the shift in the air, the faint pressure of footsteps descending the cellar stairs. The first warning came as a sudden bloom of harsh light bleeding into the outer chamber, a lantern far brighter than their single flickering lamp. Ezekiel's head snapped upward, a chill sliding down his spine as shapes sharpened in the doorway. Silas Rutald stood at the threshold with two men bracing him, and behind them shadows of more figures pooled like a living wall. At least 4 others waited in the dark beyond, silent, patient, watching. Silas stepped forward with an eerie calm, voice smooth as lacquer. He confessed his admiration as though he were praising a clever child. He had not believed they would uncover the hidden room. Catherine rose carefully, moving without fear, planting herself between Ezekiel and her father like a shield carved from quiet resolve. She reminded him sharply that he was supposed to be in Charleston. Silas only smiled, explaining that he had traveled, yes, but suspicion had never loosened its hold on him. Her miraculous return to health had struck him as far too convenient, so he had slipped back before dusk and lingered around the house, observing, waiting for the exact moment she would betray him. His footsteps echoed as he entered the inner chamber, the 2 men behind him sealing off the exit with the finality of a cell door. He asked whether they truly believed he would fail to foresee this, whether they imagined he would not prepare for the day she remembered, the day she defied him, the day she reached for vengeance. Catherine's voice did not tremble. She reminded him of the poison that had stained her life for 16 years, and dared him to believe she would simply bow her head and accept it. Silas corrected her coldly, insisting it had been necessary. She had seen something forbidden, something that shattered innocence and left no room for misunderstanding. A child could not comprehend the weight of it. He had acted to protect the order he served, the power he guarded. She cut through his excuses with a blade of memory. She had been 12 when she witnessed him butcher a woman and consume her flesh as if it were sacrament. That moment had not filled her with childish fear. It had sharpened her mind, revealed the true shape of the man who raised her. She named it for what it was: evil. A word her father dismissed as simple, uneducated, beneath the complexity of the forces he claimed to serve. Silas drifted closer, eyes sliding between his daughter and Ezekiel, studying them like specimens pinned to a board. He accused Ezekiel of using her, of infecting her with thoughts of rebellion. Ezekiel did not answer. His gaze mapped the chamber, calculating every angle, every impossible option. 7 men against them. Catherine weakened, exhausted, bruised by the truth and the long night. Escape was a fading dream. Silas sensed his thoughts. He urged them not to be reckless. He had no desire to permanently damage either of them, though he could not allow disobedience to swell any further. At his gesture, the men seized them, dragging them out of the chamber and up into the suffocating silence of the house. They were cast into Silas's study, a windowless cell of polished wood and locked doors. The only light came from a tiny transom far above reach, a mocking slice of the outside world. When the bolts slammed shut and silence returned, Catherine immediately crossed to Ezekiel, her voice low with concern. He assured her he was uninjured, but admitted the truth: they were in grave danger. She disagreed. Not entirely. She drew a folded stack of papers from the hidden seam inside her dress, the pages they had been copying with trembling hands moments earlier. Silas had not searched her. His confidence had become his weakness. Ezekiel reminded her that papers would not matter if they died. Catherine's eyes gleamed with calculation, cold and sharp. Her father might threaten her. He might cage her, but he would hesitate before killing her. Blood still meant something to him, twisted though it was. That hesitation could become their single thread of leverage. Time dragged like chains across stone. Voices drifted through the hall, unfamiliar footsteps gathering, the low hum of men assembling for something ancient, something ritualistic. The brethren were being summoned. The reckoning was taking shape. When the door finally opened, Marcus Fanning stood framed in the threshold, face stiff with unease. He instructed them to come peacefully, promising no harm if they obeyed. They were marched back down into the cellar, but the place had transformed into a chamber of ceremony. Candles lined the walls in trembling rows. Every member of the brethren sat robed in shadow, draped garments, 13 chairs in a perfect ring, one awaiting Silas, at the head beside an altar dressed in blood-red cloth. Ezekiel and Catherine were herded to the center of the circle, 2 solitary figures surrounded by silent judges. The members stared with a mixture of contempt, fascination, and simmering fear of what their exposure could mean. Silas unveiled himself, addressing them with formal gravity. He announced that a crisis threatened their carefully crafted secrecy. His daughter and her companion had found the forbidden chamber, had seen the ledger that catalogued horrors stretching back decades. They had begun copying those records when he caught them. One of the elders declared that the solution was simple: end them. Silence them permanently. Silas raised a hand, insisting that blood could not be discarded so easily. Catherine was his daughter, and Ezekiel, he claimed, presented possibility rather than threat. He turned his attention to Ezekiel, weaving a web of poison promises. He spoke of revenge, of justice draped in corruption. He offered a place beside them, not as an equal, never an equal, but as an associate permitted to witness their rights, to act in their shadow. In exchange, he would deliver the man who destroyed Ezekiel's family, a plantation owner who had worked his wife and children to death with a cruelty no court had ever punished. Silas promised resources, money, information, and the satisfaction of breaking that man piece by piece. The offer hung in the air, thick as smoke, a temptation wrapped in blasphemy, aligned with the monsters who had devoured his past, in order to destroy another monster who had torn out his heart. It was a bargain forged in darkness, as seductive as it was abhorrent, the kind of choice that reshapes a soul forever. And in the center of that circle, under the burning gaze of the brethren, Ezekiel felt the world tighten around him, forcing him to choose between damnation and death. As the candles flickered like watching eyes, Silas let the threat roll from his tongue with the softness of a man discussing weather, not murder. If Ezekiel refused, the night would swallow both him and Catherine without leaving a trace. Their bodies would sink into the swamp like offerings to something ancient and hungry, their voices silenced forever, their truth smothered beneath mud and rot. Catherine's papers would curl into ash, her journals consumed, every fragile piece of evidence erased until the world believed nothing had ever happened. Silas opened his hands like a preacher revealing scripture, promising that if Ezekiel accepted instead, life would continue. Catherine would breathe. Ezekiel would walk free. Revenge would be within reach. All it demanded was the surrender of his soul. Ezekiel's gaze drifted toward Catherine. Her face had gone ghost white, but her eyes, steady, fierce, shaking only at the edges, gave him the smallest refusal. A silent command. Dio naticoamim, Dio no ti trade humani amadiasio avivel. But his thoughts spiraled in darker directions, imagining what could be gained if he played along, if he stepped into their nest of shadows long enough to gather the truth, to stall, to strike when it counted. The idea slithered through him like a whisper of possibility. He asked the question anyway, voice stripped bare. What happens to her? Silas answered with the cold precision of a man describing livestock. She would be returned to her room, confined to her medication, locked back inside the fog they had forced upon her. She would forget what she had seen or die alongside Ezekiel if she refused. But Catherine refused to let silence claim her again. Her voice sliced through the chamber with a clarity that startled even the robed figures around them. She vowed she would never return to the darkness of forgetfulness. She dared her father to kill her, but told him she would not pretend he was anything other than a monster dressed in fine clothes. A shadow flickered across Silas's expression, hardening into something carved from stone. He declared she had chosen her fate, and before the brethren could close around her, Ezekiel spoke, the words forced out like a shield torn from his ribs. He accepted, but demanded a single condition. Catherine must walk free, not trapped in her room, not drugged into silence, not bound to this cursed house. free to leave this land, this state, this life. Free to start again. Murmurs rippled through the circle. Some scoffed, some growled. But Judge Pelham, steeped in his own twisted logic, noted the cruel brilliance of the request. The girl, he claimed, was already broken, unbelievable even if she tried to speak. But a man who hated them, who bent anyway, who stepped into their circle by choice, that was power. That was PROF. Their influence coiled far beyond loyalty. Silas weighed the idea, the glow of the candles flickering across his calculating face. Finally he agreed. Catherine would be sent north. A new name, a small sum, a life wiped clean. But she would be dead to South Carolina, to the plantation, to everyone who had ever known her. A ghost among the living, Catherine tried to protest, terror and fury mixing across her features, but Ezekiel cut her off with quiet firmness. This was the only way. She must live. He would stay. The chamber seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Silas sealed the bargain, declaring that Catherine would leave the next morning, while Ezekiel's initiation would come with the next gathering. Until then, he would remain under constant watch, every breath observed, every step shadowed. Catherine was taken away at dawn, sealed inside a closed carriage that rattled down the long path until the trees swallowed it whole. Ezekiel watched from his lone cabin, unable to speak to her, unable to offer even a final word. But the night before, when the guards led her to her room, she had turned once and met his eyes. In that single fleeting glance, he had seen understanding bloom like a fragile flower clinging to stone. She knew he had not yielded. She knew he was waiting for the moment the chains would loosen, for the moment the truth could rise. The days that followed stretched like an eternal dusk. Overseers tracked his steps. Doors that had once been barred now swung open in calculated temptation. He was given trivial tasks to occupy his hours, yet allowed access to rooms of power, to papers rich with secrets, to the cellar where rituals thick as pitch waited for him. They watched, waiting for him to falter, to flee, to expose the lie. But Ezekiel moved with eerie quiet, wearing the mask of a defeated man, obedient and unthreatening. Beneath that mask, he studied everything: the rhythms of the house, the loyalties of the enslaved, the cruelties of the overseers, the comings and goings of the brethren. Every detail burned into him like a brand. At night, when the plantation fell silent, he wrestled with the horror of what was coming. The initiation would stain him, mark him, bind him with acts designed to break the spine of morality. They wanted guilt to silence him, complicity to cage him. He wondered how much he could endure, how far justice demanded he go, whether there was a darkness so deep even vengeance could not justify stepping into it. Then came the night before the ceremony, when a knock dragged him from sleep. Silas stood at his door alone, framed by the moonlight like a specter risen from his own grave. Ezekiel stepped aside, and the man entered the small cabin, looking around as though tasting the air. He spoke softly, insisting that Ezekiel understand the weight of what would happen tomorrow. Ezekiel replied that he knew what he agreed to. Silas questioned him again, his voice colder this time, as though peeling back the skin of Ezekiel's resolve, just to see if there was a soul still trembling underneath. He sat without invitation, And in the quiet of that cramped room, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would be demanded next. She was shaking so violently, the ropes trembled against the altar stone, breath breaking against the gag as muffled cries scraped the air. Her eyes darted wildly until they locked onto Ezekiel's, begging, pleading, drowning in terror. And then Silas stepped forward with a deliberate calm that chilled the marrow, extending a blade carved for one purpose alone. A long, gleaming sliver of steel with a leather-bound handle worn smooth by countless hands. He placed it between them as though offering communion. "Take it. Choose." The words slid from his mouth like poison disguised as wisdom. Ezekiel's gaze drifted to the young woman bound beneath the candle's trembling glow. She wasn't chosen, she was selected, as one chooses a lamb for slaughter. Silas spoke again, his voice soft enough to be mistaken for kindness. He told Ezekiel that this hidden brotherhood had endured for more than 4 decades without betrayal, without one member ever exposing the horrors performed beneath Cypress Grove. Did he know why? Because they made every man equally guilty. But guilt was only the surface. Beneath that was the real lure: protection, opportunity, invisible gates flung open for those who bent the knee. He described this brotherhood as a living web stretching across the South, a place where enemies vanished into ruin, where legal storms dissolved before they formed, where fortunes rose and fell by whispered agreements. Join them, Silas promised, and Ezekiel would gain access to power he had never dreamed possible. Ezekiel murmured that such riches seemed purchased with blood, purchased with murder, purchased with the destruction of souls. Silas never even blinked. He said Ezekiel would simply be upholding the true law of the world, the eternal hierarchy that crowned the strong and crushed the weak. That was the rhythm humanity had always followed. They merely acknowledged it openly and wielded it without apology. "You murdered my family," Ezekiel said quietly, and called it order. Silas nodded with the serenity of a priest confessing faith. He would do it again. Attachment, he claimed, was nothing but a chain around a man's throat. Love, the most fatal weakness. Care about individuals, and your destiny rotted. Care about power, and you ascended. Then Silas leaned forward, shadow splitting across his face, and told Ezekiel the thing he least expected. His family was gone, yes, but their deaths could still be shaped into purpose. He spoke of reforms, of how Ezekiel could use their influence to soften brutality, improve conditions, temper cruelty. He could speak in rooms that mattered, be a knife that cut change from within. For a moment, a brief, dangerous moment, it almost felt convincing. The dream of infiltration, the fantasy of healing a corrupt beast from inside its ribcage. But Ezekiel recognized the truth beneath the honeyed lie. Once he crossed their threshold, once he lifted that knife, the corruption would coil around him. He would belong to them. There could be no turning back, so he asked Silas why he was being told all of this. Because, Silas whispered, he needed Ezekiel to succeed. A living asset held more value than a dead enemy. He admitted to killing Ezekiel's family, but claimed he had no desire to kill Ezekiel himself. Then he rose, looming as the cabin's shadows swallowed the edges of his face. Tomorrow night, he warned, the test would come, and Ezekiel would have to do something that would carve into him forever. Whatever command was given, he must obey. No hesitation, no tremor, no weakness. Because if he faltered, not only would he die, Catherine would die with him. Silas revealed what Ezekiel had only dared suspect. Catherine was not in Philadelphia. She was hiding, plotting, breathing free air only because Silas allowed it. And eyes watched for her everywhere. If she surfaced before Ezekiel proved himself, she would be silenced permanently. Do you understand? A coldness unlike anything had felt before flooded Ezekiel's veins, spreading outward like frost consuming a field. Catherine lived, but her life dangled from a single, fraying thread. His actions tomorrow would determine whether she survived or vanished. He answered with barely audible resolve. Silas nodded and slipped into the night, leaving Ezekiel alone with darkness that felt thicker, heavier, almost alive. When the door closed, Ezekiel sank onto the bed, swallowed by the crushing realization of the path ahead. He would be demanded to commit something unspeakable, to satisfy monsters with an act as vile as their own hearts. He either became part of their nightmare or found a third path, a path they could not predict. He unfolded the paper bearing the names of his family. The moon's pale glow brushed across the ink, turning the letters into ghosts. "Forgive me," he whispered to the night. "Forgive what I must do. Forgive who I must become. I swear this will not be in vain." Midnight arrived like a blade sinking into the sky. Two members of the Brotherhood dragged him from his cabin, stripped him bare to the waist, bound his wrists behind him, and guided him down the narrow stairs into the cellar. The air grew colder with every step, vibrating with low, rhythmic chanting. Candles lined the chamber, their flames bending as though recoiling from what was about to happen. All 13 men waited in their dark robes, faces hidden, souls exposed in all their ugliness. Silas stood at the head of the altar, addressing them with a voice that echoed through the stone. "Tonight," he declared, "they welcomed an initiate unlike any before, a man whose hatred was earned by their own hands, a man carved from loss, a man who would prove the reach of their influence, stretched even into the hearts of their enemies." A bound figure was brought forward, trembling with each breath. When they laid her upon the altar, Ezekiel felt his stomach twist. She was so young, barely grown. Terror clung to her like a second skin. "This is your test." Silas motioned toward the blade resting between them. "To join us, you must take the knife and open her flesh. You must prove your hunger for vengeance outweighs any weakness of conscience. Refuse, and your blood will stain these stones by dawn. Accept, and we will help you destroy the man who slaughtered your family." The chanting swelled, a guttural, ancient vibration rising from the depths of language itself. Shadows quivered, candles shuddered. The air rippled with anticipation, and Ezekiel felt the night close around him, like a throat preparing to swallow his soul. He stared into the woman's eyes, and in their trembling reflection, he saw every soul the world had crushed. Beneath the weight of men, like the brethren, he saw Sarah's quiet courage, Benjamin's small hands reaching for him, Ruth's soft humming in the evenings, and beyond them, he saw the faint outline of his own face, the man he had been and the man he was about to become. The knife glimmered in his hand like a promise forged in darkness. Silas watched him with a calmness that mocked the tension thrumming through the chamber, while the 13 hooded figures waited, hungry for the moment he would choose damnation or death. This was the moment everything converged, the thin edge where destiny tilted. Surrender to them, and he would be reborn as something hollow and monstrous. Resist, and he would die at their feet. Yet there was another path, one he had carved in secret for 3 long weeks. A path that required precision, desperation, and the willingness to lose everything except his soul. He stepped closer to the altar, raising the blade as though accepting the script they had written for him. The chanting surged into a single pulsing rhythm that echoed through the stone chamber. The woman's breath came in frantic bursts behind her gag, her eyes glistening like shattered glass. Silas gave him a thin, triumphant smile, and then Ezekiel moved. Not toward the innocent body on the altar, but toward the nearest robbed figure lurking beside him. The knife erupted in a streak of silver and sank into flesh before the brethren even understood betrayal had taken shape in their midst. A wet gasp, blood painting the air. The man collapsed without a word, swallowed by the stunned silence that followed. Ezekiel tore the dying man's robe free, dragging it across a cluster of candles until the flames guttered and half the chamber plunged into shadow. Panic broke through the ranks. Their chant dissolved into shouts, their composure unraveling like rotten cloth. He surged through them with a violence sharpened by grief, grabbing one man and hurling him into the path of another's swinging arm. Bones snapped. Someone screamed. A candle stand crashed into a skull, extinguishing more flames, deepening the darkness until only fractured flickers lit the carnage. These men, who claimed dominion over life and death, had never been close enough to violence to feel its breath. They were accustomed to ordering brutality, not enduring it. They clawed at him in clumsy desperation, while Ezekiel moved with a clarity carved from years of suffering. He reached the altar, sliced through the ropes binding the trembling young woman, and shoved her toward the stairs. Run. The word tore from his throat with the force of a command meant for survival itself. She stumbled up the steps and vanished into the upper rooms, her footsteps fading like a prayer fleeing a nightmare. Ezekiel turned back and saw the remaining brethren gathering themselves. 7 stood between him and the only exit. Silas lingered behind them, untouched, cold, calculating, as though the ruin unfolding around him were merely an inconvenience. You have doomed yourself. You have doomed her. Silas spoke with chilling certainty. Catherine dies for your failure, maybe, Ezekiel replied, breath ragged yet steady. Maybe, but I won't leave this world until I drag as many of you down with me as I can. What he could not know, what none of them could have foreseen, was that above their heads, in the rooms of the grand house, Catherine had already returned. She had never fled north. She had hidden in the shadows of the slave quarters, watching Cypress grow from within the wounds of its own past. She had waited, listening, planning, gathering allies from the people whose lives had been trampled by her father and his brethren. When she heard the frantic footsteps of the freed woman bursting into the kitchen, when she heard the chaos spilling from the cellar, like a rising storm. She knew the night had finally come. The reckoning she had carried in her bones for 16 years. She had spent 3 weeks slipping across plantations by moonlight, speaking to men and women who had lost children to the Brethren's rituals, who had buried friends without answers, who had endured cruelty handed down with smiles and scripture. She told them everything, the cellar, the rituals, the truth, and they came. 23 souls who had been denied justice for their entire lives. They came armed with scythes and axes, with hammers and rusted blades, but more powerful than their weapons was the fury they had held inside for generations. When the young woman burst into the open with terror spilling from her throat, Catherine led them down into the depths. The Brethren, still trying to overwhelm Ezekiel, never heard the thunder of footsteps descending upon them, until it erupted into the chamber. The enslaved people surged forward like a tidal wave breaking against a corrupt altar. There was no mercy left in any heart. There was no hesitation. This was not vengeance. This was the unearthing of a truth long buried beneath blood and silence. Judge Pillam raised a pistol, but an axe found him before he could aim. Reverend Crenshaw begged, voice trembling, but the plea dissolved beneath the weight of a hammer. Marcus Fanning bolted toward the stairs and was dragged back into the darkness he had helped create. Silas, the architect of so much suffering, seized Catherine and pressed a blade to her throat. Stop, or she dies. The chamber froze, the air tightening like a noose. Catherine met her father's gaze without an ounce of fear. Do it. Kill me. It changes nothing. You've already lost. He hissed a denial, some promise of power, of escape, but she cut him off with a whisper colder than winter earth. You can still nothing. Her elbow cracked against his ribs. He faltered. She twisted free, and before Silas could gather himself, Ezekiel stepped between them, the two men facing each other at last. All the privilege Silas had wielded, all the cruelty he had delivered with a steady hand, it drained from him in an instant. The man who had destroyed Ezekiel's life, who had believed himself untouchable, now trembled before the very truth he had created. You took everything from me, Ezekiel said, voice quiet but trembling with the weight of years. My family, my world, and you did it because you wanted to. Because you thought no one would ever stop you. Silas whispered one word, thin and shaking. Please. But mercy had no place in the world Silas had built. Understood. I will continue in the exact same voice and tone as the previous rewritten part. The slow, poetic, immersive horror narration style crafted specifically for Gospel of the Haunted. The word echoed in the chamber like something obscene, something that did not belong in the mouth of a man who had carved suffering into the bones of others. Please. Ezekiel stared at him, and in that flicker of breath, he saw the ghosts of his wife and child, saw the endless nameless souls who had been dragged beneath these stones. None of them had been granted mercy. Their cries had never slowed a blade. Their terror had never softened a hand. So Ezekiel gave him the only truth that remained. There would be no forgiveness. Not tonight. Not for a man who had built an empire from agony. When the final scream died, the cellar settled into a terrible silence. 13 shadows, men who once strutted through the world as though it were theirs to rule, lay crumpled among overturned candles and widening pools of red. Pawiyar had abandoned them. The illusion of invincibility had burned away. In the end, they were just men, dying like the countless people they had destroyed. At the center of it all stood Catherine, trembling not from fear, but from the shudder of release. 16 years of swallowed rage poured out of her in a single exhale, a lifetime of torment finally given shape and ending. Ezekiel stepped toward her, bruised, bleeding, breathless. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No. And you?" she asked. "Cuts. Nothing more." They looked over the carnage, over the remnants of a legacy soaked in cruelty. "What comes next?" Ezekiel asked. Catherine let out a low, fierce breath. "Now we end it. Every trace, every secret, every lie. We burn Cypress Grove until nothing remains but ash." He hesitated. The ledger, it could expose them. It could bring justice. Her laugh was sharp, hollow. "This is justice. The only kind the world ever intended for us." She walked through the room, gesturing at the bodies. "If we go to the law, we die. And the brethren in other counties come for anyone tied to tonight. The only future we buy is the one built on silence." Ezekiel understood. Justice, as the world defined it, had never been meant for people like them. "Then we burn it," he said. The next hours drifted by with grim purpose. The enslaved men and women who had fought beside them slipped into the pre-dawn shadows, returning to fields and cabins as though they had never left. They would speak to no one. Secrets were survival, silence was freedom. Catherine and Ezekiel worked methodically, spreading oil across the stones, stacking wood beneath beams, arranging the corpses to mimic tragedy and not truth. They placed the brethren's ledger atop the altar, the last artifact of a legacy built from torment. "Wet," Ezekiel murmured. He opened the ledger one final time, found the entries bearing his family's names. Their deaths reduced to ink, to tidy lines in a book of horrors. He tore the pages free, folded them with trembling fingers, and tucked them close to his chest. "So they are not erased." Catherine nodded once. "Then let it burn." She touched a candle's flame to the soaked wood. Fire blossomed like a hungry thing finally freed, racing across the cellar with a roar that felt almost alive. They fled up the staircase and into the yard as heat grew behind them, as the house shuddered with the birth of destruction. Outside, Cypress Grove glowed like a dying star. Flames crawled up the pillars and swallowed the walls, lightning flashes of ember sparking into the sky. The plantation that had stood as a monument to power now crumbled in on itself, devoured by the same darkness it had fed for decades. People would come. Questions would follow. But Catherine and Ezekiel already held the story between them. A fallen candle, a tragic fire, a gathering gone terribly wrong, and no one would dare question the deaths of 13 well-respected men too closely. As the sun bled across the horizon, Catherine turned toward Ezekiel, her face illuminated by the burning ruin of her father's world. "What happens to you now?" "I go north," he said softly. "Disappear while everything is in chaos. Find others who fight back. Build something that helps people slip through the cracks." He placed a hand against the paper inside his shirt. "I can't bring my family back, but I can keep their memory from rotting in silence." "And I'll go north too," she murmured. "Use the money I hid from him. Start a new life. But I won't let this night vanish. I'll write everything, every truth. One day when no one can hurt us anymore, someone will find it. They'll bury your words." Ezekiel warned. "Then I'll hide them where even the living can't reach," she replied. "Truth finds its way, even when the world tries to smother it." They watched until the fire consumed itself, until Cypress Grove was nothing more than a skeleton of blackened beams and drifting smoke. Nothing remained of the men who had gathered there to spill innocent blood. Nothing remained of the place that had held so many ghosts. At last, they walked away, two silhouettes dividing at the edge of the road, Catherine toward the north, Ezekiel toward the wild frontier. Paths that crossed for one night and would never intersect again. The world would remember the official tale, a tragic fire, a meeting of gentlemen ended in misfortune, an entire chapter of the South left grieving. But the truth, buried beneath the ashes, whispered in the ruins, and gospel of the haunted would one day breathe it back into the world. Funerals were held with all the solemnity that tradition demanded. Eulogies praised their contributions to society, painted their names in gold against the black of history, and no one paused to wonder what truths were buried beneath the smoke and flame. Catherine Ruttled, the mad daughter trapped in her room that night, was reported dead in the fire. A sad, almost poetic footnote to a catastrophe that had already consumed so much, a story left unquestioned. No one looked too closely. No one pressed against the veil of official reports. The enslaved people who had taken part in the reckoning said nothing, and in their silence lay a quiet, unyielding power. They had survived. They had witnessed. And every reason to speak was outweighed by every reason to remain silent. In the months that followed, Cypress Grove dissolved into rumor and ruin. The plantation's holdings were sold, its people scattered across South Carolina and beyond, uprooted from the only home they had ever known. Yet they carried something unspoken with them, a secret heavy as stone, the memory of what they had done, of what had been done to them, and the knowledge that the world of men who thought themselves untouchable had been shaken. Years passed, and new buildings rose where the blackened timbers once lay, a landscape attempting to erase the horrors it had sheltered. But the past refuses to be erased entirely. In the quiet of slave quarters, by candlelight and the shiver of wind through shutters, whispers persisted. Tales of the plantation that had burned, of the night when the powerful were made to bleed, of a woman and a man who refused to bow. The stories shifted with every telling, taking on the hue of myth, the cadence of legend, but at their heart, the same truth remained: cruelty carries a price. Power is never absolute, and the powerless sometimes wield the most dangerous strength of all. In the year 1863, the land that had cradled Cypress Grove came under the watch of Union troops. Soldiers stumbled across remnants that hinted at the plantation's grim past, hidden tunnels beneath the earth, bones long forgotten in the swamp, strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, marks that suggested rituals, offerings, and devotion to something older and darker than law or morality. But the war surged forward, carrying men, attention, and resources with it, leaving the mysteries of Cypress Grove to fester quietly beneath the soil. Time marched on, indifferent. By 1971, during demolition of some old buildings erected atop the plantation's former grounds, a journal surfaced. Sealed behind a wall, it contained the meticulous account of what had occurred. Names, dates, rituals, victims, every atrocity inked with chilling clarity. Yet, as Catherine had foreseen, the journal was coded, wrapped in riddles and symbols meant to protect its truths. And before anyone could fully unravel its secrets, it vanished. Some whispered it had been destroyed, swallowed by fire or careless hands. Others believed descendants of the Brethren had spirited it away, guardians of a legacy of darkness. A few even whispered that it still exists, lying in wait, hidden until the time is right for it to be rediscovered, for history to tremble once more. What is certain is that 13 men of wealth and influence, died in a fire in 1841. Catherine Ruttle disappeared shortly after, her fate unconfirmed, the truth swallowed by shadow and rumor. Ezekiel Cross, the enslaved man who had faced the horrors within Cypress Grove, was said to have been sold to a plantation in Alabama, yet the records tell nothing. The paper trail vanishes, as though he too had become a ghost, moving unseen, untouchable, a living testament to resistance. Stories lingered in the enslaved communities long after. They spoke of a network, a secretive force aiding escape, led by a man who had faced monsters and emerged alive. Whether these accounts were rooted in truth or in the desperate hope of the oppressed is impossible to say. But they endured because stories, even whispers, have power. They are vessels for memory, for justice, for the refusal to let atrocities fade into dust. This history, shrouded in secrecy and rumor, reveals something unsettling about power built on cruelty. No fortress of oppression is impregnable. Secrets, even those buried deep in shadow and blood, are never safe from discovery. And the people deemed powerless, the ones forced to endure, often hold the most potent weapons, the power to witness, the power to remember, the power to refuse to forget. Even now, one might wonder if that journal still exists somewhere, hidden, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. Perhaps it lies in a dusty attic, or behind a false panel in a long, abandoned house, or in the careful custody of someone who understands the danger of truth. One cannot know, yet the possibility lingers, an itch at the back of memory, the promise that the past is never truly dead. The ruins of Cypress Grove are long gone. Ashes scattered. Earth reclaimed the space. Yet the fire left more than destruction. It left stories, whispered in shadows, carried across generations, testimony to the night the powerless rose, to the courage of those who dared, and to the terrible justice wrought in silence and blood. The memory of Ezekiel and Catherine, of the young woman who ran and the lives reclaimed, lingers, shaping the legends told beside hearths, around fields, under the cover of night where truth might otherwise vanish. Power that is absolute in appearance is fragile in reality. Shadows once hidden always stretch, always reach, always whisper of what cannot remain buried forever, and in that, there is hope. Not the hope of restitution, not the hope of perfect justice, but the hope that memory endures. That witness matters. That silence is not always defeat. So Cypress Grove became more than ruins. It became a warning, a story, a shadow in the corners of history, a pulse beneath the official narrative, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and even the weakest can strike back. And Gospel of the Haunted ensures that such stories are not allowed to vanish, that the whispers of those who dared to act in the dark will find ears willing to remember, hearts willing to feel the cold brush of history, and the fierce warmth of justice long overdue. The world may record only the fire, the death, the tragedy, but the truth survives in stories, in memories, in the refusal to forget. Power built on cruelty is never as solid as it seems, and the powerless sometimes wield the most dangerous force imaginable, the force of action, of memory, of uncompromising witness. And so the ashes of Cypress Grove tell their story, carried in silence and whispers, waiting for the next voice to breathe them into life, to ensure that no matter how deeply secrets are buried, darkness cannot contain them forever.